not just that these values are being pushed, but they're also celebrated as like it's a badge of honor to have the pride flag or the Indigenous flag or whatever the case may be on your company, and it's a performative system of saying, hey, look, as the cliche is virtue signaling. Hey, look how moral I am. Don't call me an immoral company. I've got the pride flag. I've got the Indigenous flag up on my boardroom or whatever the case.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast. Live from the Facebook main page, my name is Andrew Cremant, and joining me as co-host today is Will Jeffries. Hello, Will.
Hello, Andrew. How are you, mate? Good to be here.
I'm good. It's good to see you. Net zero, safe spaces. There was once a time when these terms were disconnected from the ordinary Australian. Now our cultural and intellectual vanguard are making it difficult to do business without thinking about them. Is woke capitalism a natural evolution of what came before, or is it hurting Australia? To discuss this and more, we're joined by Dara MacDonald, former research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs and founder of All-1. Dara, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you on. As always, to our audience, you can post your comments in the comment section throughout the hour, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Firstly, Dara, tell us a little bit about yourself and All-1, the organisation you founded.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a previous research fellow with the IPA, and between those jobs, I also practice law. I'm in-house legal counsel for a major company, and on the side, I have an organisation called All-1, and really it's the brainchild of me wanting to do something in the cultural space. Precisely because, as the topic today illustrates, some of the biggest issues we're facing are in this, the realm of culture, and not necessarily in politics and policy and, these sorts of things that we end up having huge spats about. But in the end, the people that are making huge differences are the people that are operating in the cultural space. So I wanted to find the people in Australia that were interested in that. So I created this organisation called All-1, which is at the moment operating as a private members club where we have events, which if you go to the website all-1.org.au, you can sign up and you can come to events. The next one is October the 10th with Professor Gigi Foster. So have a look there and you can join up and become a member.
Right, we have interviewed Gigi Foster on this show. We can try and put the link to that in the comments section.
So, I'm just wondering, what do you think are the motives that are driving woke capitalists, so to say, to discuss social issues? Is their motive to actually improve people's lives, or are they trying to perhaps distract from some of the more immoral decisions they're making whilst running their business and the impact of their business on their society?
I'm very much in the camp that, this is very much a case of the road to hell being paved by good intentions. I think the people that are pushing this actually think they're doing good. And it's not, and there's multiple levels of this. There's the people that are really pushing this, which is, your big investment companies, your BlackRock, your Vanguard, which are the shareholder activists that really push these policies down the companies. Likewise, with lots of industry bodies, so you can't sign up to an industry body without signing up to these environmental social responsibility policies. But then you get to the companies that have to do business with these. If you want the investment of Vanguard or BlackRock, you need to sign up to these policies. So it's a bit, to put the crude example, if you want to appear in Harvey Weinstein's movie, you know what you have to do. And then likewise, if you sign up, if you look at any kind of government tender, they all put as part of their requirements, they put that you have to have certain policies in place, Indigenous participation policy, all these sorts of typical ES R-type policies, you need to have them in place to even be in the ballpark of tendering on these big companies and big government projects, right? So people play by the rules that they're shown. So there's just various levels of this. I think the people right up the top really do think they're making a difference and doing a good thing. Then there's the people that know that you need to play the game if you want the money of the people that are, pushing this agenda. So I think there's some cynical actors or cynical, wanting to earn the dollars, and then there's the people that really do think that they're doing good.
Mm.
So do you believe that there are any companies that have actually gone under after adopting woke ideologies, particularly in Australia?
No, I actually am not I'm not the person that believes in this go woke, go broke type mythos. I think actually the biggest customers are, government, big companies. And if you want them as a customer, you need to have these policies in place. So you need to be a woke capitalist yourself if you want to be a customer for woke capitalist organizations. So I don't actually believe that any companies have really gone under for promoting this. Maybe with the customers, maybe the customers go, oh no, and then 1 week and then go, oh no, actually I want to buy the same product that I have for the last 20 years. Again, they forget very quickly. But for the most part, I think that actually it's very good for business. And you can notice that they don't touch certain topics. It's not, workers' rights that they're worried about. It's, it's everything, everything is pride or environment or stuff that they can actually market properly, not things that are actually going to raise their working capital necessary. So.
Well, the implications for Australia is really quite profound. I mean, you look at, for instance, Stanmore Coal. They couldn't raise any money from Australian banks, so they had to go to Asian banks. Not that there's anything wrong with Asian banks as such for finance at a 13% rate, but some of Australia's most prized assets, and now Australian shareholders have no access to them. I mean, the profound dividends that Whitehaven Coal are paying at the moment, I mean, absurd. None of the super funds will touch Whitehaven Coal because of that ESG metric that they have to abide by. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but, maybe touch on the way in which average Australians are being held back by this.
Well, yeah, I think this is is a real gap in the market. There's now a product, product in competition with your Vanguards and so on in America at the moment called Strive by Vivek
Ramaswamy.
Ramaswamy, there we go. That actually competes with that, and we could do with something like that in Australia, where if you want to put your money where your mouth is, that you invest in coal or these assets that are doing really well, so you don't have to buy the narrative or buy the ESG narrative that is being sold to us. I think, as I said, we lose out as average Australians, but of course the big banks and these investment bodies are clearly playing by the rules that they're told they need to play by. So, they have their own agenda. They have their own reasons for not backing coal. But the problem is that if you don't follow this ideological trend, then you have no place to go. You have no place to put your dollar. You have no place to buy from if all the companies in the industry behave a certain way and follow the same trend. So this is where really we could really use some a competitor that really goes against and gives ordinary Australians another option if they don't want to go through this value system.
So you think a competitor is the answer as opposed to perhaps some sort of regulation in the name of some sort of anti-monopoly regulation or regulation to address the fact that the hegemony in corporate Australia when it comes to ideology and politics is, you could argue, undermining the potency of our democracy to represent the average bloke. Do we need
Yeah.
regulation and competition, or just one or the other?
I'm a bit skeptical about what kind of regulation could actually fix this problem. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to hear proposals, but I think the main problem is, as you know, as it's put forward, is a cultural problem. It's a cultural problem in these organizations that they've become a monoculture with a very particular set of value system. And if you work in these companies, you have a really big problem as well. Like, it's not, you know, it's also the employees have a problem. So if you don't go along with these ideas, then, you know, the saying "you bring your whole self to work" only really applies to people that agree with the company ethos. So, you know, I think it would be really hard to make targeted regulation that would enforce these companies to be pluralist in their outlook, particularly because governments are one of the worst offenders. Like, the public service is one of the worst offenders whenever you apply for a government tender. They are the ones that are pushing some of these policies really, really hard. So they themselves are part of this culture, which says ESG is a good thing. So I think it's very, very hard to come up with some regulation that would be effective. And even more so, I don't think you would see government actually pushing it, because they're, as I said, one of the worst offenders in this space.
Fair play.
In regards to pushing for new competition, you know, part of the problem with that is that the moment a new competitor arrives, they're automatically labelled, racist, sexist, socialist, so fascist, not socialist, quite frankly. I've got a quote here by Louis Essen on the Australian out. Forgive me if there's background noise. On the Australianality of Things Australian, the rebel, that is the originator, the man who stamps character, personality on the things of this world, always seeks the new thing, the unknown, terra australis, and it is only the rebel who ever becomes the classic. Thus all old masters are Australian. How does one become a competitor against some? You're essentially competing against government and against industry. And how does one become a competitor?
That's actually a very good question. I think one of the biggest problems that, as the previous question alluded to, is that this has become quite a monopoly. I think one of the best things is, because it has become a monopoly, there is a whole section of the public that is not catered for. So as soon as there is a competitor, there would be a lot of people that would be interested. I think, to give the Strive example, I think within a few, 24 hours of launching, they had, I can't remember the precise figures, but it was like groundbreaking the amount of signups they had the first 24 hours since launching, because there was suddenly a competitor, and suddenly somewhere that people that didn't agree with these policies could put their money. The question is the breakthrough part. And I think it would be much easier for usual companies that are doing goods, as opposed to tech companies, because they are working on a network basis. Like, you don't want to be the first person to sign up to a new platform because there'll be no one to talk to. But for these traditional companies that are producing goods like cars and electricity and these sorts of things, it'll be much easier for them to break into this market, purely because it is so it doesn't rely on this network effect. So I think that it is possible, but obviously you need someone that is willing to take a hard stance, I would say, and it takes a particular type of person to do that. So you might need to, a kind of Steve Jobs or something of the right, or not even the right, the non-woke, I guess, to put something forward.
Well, I mean, the banking question is a big one, because, between 1912 and 1924, under Sir Dennis and Miller, Australia actually had a national bank, the Commonwealth Bank, and it was tasked with building the country, everything from railroads to dams to power stations, and we did that, and it was profoundly successful. I know as a former member of the Institute of Public Affairs, which I'm a big fan of, I'm asking the question, do you think there is a role for some sort of national infrastructure development bank that supersedes politics. And sure, if Labor was in power, or perhaps a modern liberal, leader was in power, they, used the power of that credit to build solar farms and wind turbines. But at least if someone like perhaps an Abbott was to be involved, they'd have that power, which at the moment the government doesn't really.
Yeah, I guess the problem with that is that it would be kind of like a winner-take-all kind of mentality, particularly if it runs from the executive branch. Then there is really an incentive to win the election if you want, because whoever gets hold of this particular weapon can use it to, do whatever the hell they want, build whatever they consider to be the greater good. I guess the issue with that is that you don't necessarily know whether your guy is going to end up in power. And there's definitely, this argument is playing out in the US at the moment with the kind of the Trump candidates. I mean, I was very sympathetic to Trump. I was a bit of a Trump fan, but the kind of the argument being that because the right tends to grab hold of politics and we lose the cultural space, then we should use politics to ram down our vision instead of using the culture. And I think obviously the danger of that is that if you create a weapon, your adversary can also use that weapon. And I'm as I said, I'm a little bit skeptical as to how we'd go about creating that, or how that would actually help the issue necessarily, particularly when government itself is imbued with these values. So you would have to basically clear out the entire public service and replace them with people that are sympathetic to your cause, which
it's practically impossible.
And even if you did that, how would even people that you were sympathetic to, how would you agree what the greater good is? That even on the right, we have our stats about what kind of constitutes good in this space. So I think it would be very hard to find today, in this day and age, very hard to find a kind of shared vision, and then also implement a shared vision. It's just one of the downsides of this kind of fractured society that we live in, is that we can't really decide what would be in the national good and then implement it.
Guy Rundle, a left-wing journalist, has voiced his concern about the contradictions of the elites, labelling it as the knowledge class, which would include people from journalism, technology, finance, and within the arts. How did this umbrella of thinking evolve to become an amalgamation of left-wing thinking and jobs that happen to rely on less labour?
I think, this is like a very much an interesting point of that this type of thinking has ended up on the left, when traditionally you would associate the left with, labour, traditional labour, manufacturing, these sorts of things. But I think firstly, it's a reflection on the decline in those heavy industries, and secondly, I was at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas over the last weekend, and both one of the chair of this panel on woke capitalism and a questioner in the audience made a similar point of saying that the political process wasn't producing the outcome we wanted quick enough. For net zero, the political process were not producing the outcome we wanted. Therefore, we went to the corporations, and the corporations listened. I think this is the result of a democratic system, which is not a winner-takes-all system. It is you vote in the party that you like, you want, and then they form government, and if they have the majority, they form government, but they still have to negotiate with the opposition party. So everyone ends up dissatisfied, but they don't end up nearly as dissatisfied as if it was a winner-take-all situation, and the governing party could, enact radical change. So in this respect, what they're asking for is basically absolute monarchy. is they want a system where their change gets put through super fast instead of having to negotiate with the people that are in opposition. And I think the reason this is not necessarily a left-right issue. It's more of like literal technocrats. It's the ideology of the software developer that sees everything in a linear fashion, and they go, oh, okay, so we want to get to this goal, and this is we're going to program the perfect code to get to this goal. And if there's a mistake somewhere, we just go back and fix it. There's no biggie. But in the real world, it doesn't work like that. In the real world, we've seen this for the last few years with COVID, for instance. The whole entire government apparatus was directed to this goal of zero COVID. Or you could see the analogous thing happen with net zero with climate change. And so you direct everything towards a singular end, and then you end up with all these negative externalities. With the COVID situation, we had school closures, and I thought even the left had told us that education was a good idea, but here we are closing the schools and services zero COVID. We were told that medical care is a good thing, and during that time I was living on the New South Wales-Queensland border, and they were separating mothers from newborns because they weren't allowed to cross the border to go to the Brisbane hospital, for instance. Like very inhumane things done in service of getting to this goal of zero COVID. So you end up in a situation that there's the very thing that ESG, environmental social responsibility, was meant to remedy, the fact that corporations in pursuing profits have these negative externalities. You end up with the same thing happening again. It's just that instead of pursuing, whatever profit, they're pursuing zero COVID or net zero emissions, which also has consequences. There's always trade-offs to every action. It's just depending on which action you're taking. So that's kind of the mentality that they're working with. They're working with, like, okay, so we want to get to here. We want to get to net zero, and corporations are far more effective vehicle of doing one thing and one thing only. Whereas government, you have to, particularly in the political space, you have to have this clash of ideas and come away with, maybe 70% of what you wanted, because you have to negotiate. So I think it's more of the idea of a technocrat rather than of the layman, of the factory worker that has to assemble things and has to have things that work in the real world. If that makes sense.
Well, speaking of the real world, there was a great paper that came out of the Australian National University a couple of weeks ago, and it found that there's 408 regional and remote locations across Australia with a combined population of over 600,000 people where their water quality was below regulatory standards. And 40% of all these locations were remote Indigenous communities. Yet in the boardrooms of corporate Australia, before any word is uttered, there has to be a welcome to country, and there's also celebrations for NIDOC Day and several other days to celebrate Indigenous culture and reflect on the past wrongs. I guess what I'd like you to touch on is slacktivism. Surely if corporate Australia was concerned about improving lives for our Indigenous brothers and sisters, they'd focus on improving their water quality, on addressing the fact that there were remote communities relying upon bore water contaminated with uranium, arsenic, and nitrates, instead of giving a 30-second welcome to country before a board meeting. It seems quite unfair and immoral and slack.
Yeah, it's definitely performative. You need to be able. The thing is, it's not just that these values are being pushed, but they're also celebrated. It's like it's a badge of honor to have the pride flag or the Indigenous flag or whatever the case may be on your company, and it's a performative system of saying, hey, look, as the cliche is virtue signaling. Hey, look how moral I am. Don't call me an immoral company. I've got the pride flag. I've got the Indigenous flag up on my boardroom or whatever the case may be. I think, and then they push back and say, well, the water is the government's responsibility.
Yeah.
Apparently, having energy policy is not the government's responsibility, but
yeah.
I mean, it is very hypocritical, to say the least.
You use the word performative. I just like to delve into the operations of woke, because the way that I understood it, especially from my undergrad, is that woke is very anti-essentialist, and that it's in that meaning in a sense is a dialogue between the person looking at it and what is there, but ultimately it depends on who is looking at it. So you usually have this unaccountable vanguard, who decide what is moral, what is not, who is good and who is evil, and it always seems to support support an agenda that seems to, in a sense, be against the culture and against the country. But can you explain the operations of woke?
The operations of woke. Well, I think if you're taking it from the top down, it is very much coming from the universities through this critical race theory, your critical theories. But by the time it gets to the companies, it is kind of like the shell of that, or the bells and whistles of the critical theory, without all the kind of a little bit of the mumbo jumbo, a little bit of the jargon, but it's made its way in this nice, neat package to what looks like, traditional values that you would have, say, of course, everyone wants to, going back to the last question, everyone wants to tackle the problems with Indigenous Australia, and particularly, we can look at very much, the statistics to say how poorly a lot of the remote Indigenous communities are doing. But instead of, doing the job of actually fixing the root of those problems, which are very practical, the water quality, that there's no jobs in these communities, these sorts of things, land rights. Then instead of doing that, what the root of the problem, according to critical theories, are these amorphous terms like, systemic racism. But you can't do anything. It's not like you can't do anything to fix it, because it's not racism, it is systemic racism. So it's this really amorphous, all-encompassing concept. And so really the only thing you can do is atone for your sins by posting, a flag. It's kind of like, it is a religion in that respect. It's like, it's quasi-religious. It's not doing something practically to help someone. It is, absolving yourself of the sins of this larger amorphous concept of.
It's like paying the church to forgive your sins on God's behalf before death.
Yeah.
Yeah, cheers. Well, one thing I'd like to ask is, do you think there's a reckoning coming? Because, I talk to people in corporate Australia every now and then, and I always like to ask them, what's steel made out of? They can't answer the question. It's iron ore and coke and coal. Did you know that the production of fertilizer is reliant upon urea, which is reliant upon natural gas? Did you know that carbon dioxide is only 0.04% of the atmosphere, and 97% of carbon dioxide is naturally sequestered? They don't know that. But we're going to see, it looks like, food shortages, energy shortages, judging by the situation in Europe. Is there going to be a reckoning whereby corporate Australia and these whatever you want to call them, woke leaders or whatever, have to come back to reality and focus on the fundamentals of profit and providing critical services and goods?
We would hope so, but I'm not quite sure whether it's going to come nearly as fast as it needs to. I posted a comment of me being way too rational, that there was the dress that Green Senator was wearing with no coal, no gas. I posted a comment saying, you do realize that in order to create petrochemicals, you either need coal or gas. How are you supposed to create electric vehicles without either of those things? But
Exactly.
That's just being way too rational, like knowing how things function in the real world. I think it is definitely overdue. definitely these people that are making all the decisions don't have any kind of practical understanding of how things operate. As I said, it is the software developer, not the factory worker, that is coming up with these ideas that think, oh, well, we can just create perfect policies that create this like linear effect, and you get this thing at the end, and it's all going to be hunky-dory, without realizing that there are these issues that still flow from it. You can see with the war in Ukraine that the not having energy security is akin to not having national security, particularly with Germany. So there's all these issues that flow from when you pursue this one tiny singular goal without seeing all these amorphous things or these issues that flow from it. It's kind of like, as I said, creating a solution to one problem, but then in doing that you create all these other problems, but they can't see the other problems because they're not versed in trade-offs. They just see this thing and not the whole picture.
Do you think then that the relationship between wokeness and corporatism is merely a fad, or it will continue?
I think it will get worse before it gets better. I think we have to have a proper reckoning of, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to suffer before we realize how bad an idea it is. I mean, even with the cost of living crisis, I think people don't really understand, with energy bills going up and so on, that every poll, you always get this quoted back to you, that every poll says that people are happy to pay more for electricity if it means tackling climate change, and don't think it means that everything else, the cost of every single other thing else rises, because if you want to keep the coffee machine on, and the coffee machine costs more to keep on because the power is more expensive, then your coffee is going to go up, and so on and so forth all the way down the line. But I think people are going to have to suffer before they realize that it's a bad idea, unfortunately. I wish it would be the case. I wish we could learn from the mistakes of what's happening in Europe right now, but I think we're probably going to have to experience it for ourselves before we turn the ship around.
It's finally enough, even though we have various mandates that stop various people from working in various industries if they don't get a certain vaccine. Even such standout incidents are not enough. It's only when it hits the hip pocket and hits it continually week after week, perhaps even year after year, depending on what's going to happen with Ukraine, as well as China and Taiwan. Only then you think it's going to start changing.
I think there will be slight changes. Maybe some people will wake up, and then we'll go wake up to the work, and then maybe try and create some alternatives. We can hope, but I think for the vast majority, there's going to have to be, particularly in Australia, because we're quite comfortable and we're quite shielded from lots of the world's issues, which is actually really quite sad that we're in the situation that we are, because we're so rich in so many natural goods. But I think we're so shielded. We have such a prosperous lifestyle in Australia, and most people are actually quite wealthy here. And so I think it is going to have to get quite a bit worse before we maybe try and rejig things. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, it's the crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know how bad things are going to get or how bad it has to get before we realize that we're on a wrong trajectory. But I definitely don't see, maybe this is me living in Sydney at the moment, but I don't see people necessarily motivated to change something at the present.
Right.
Do you think that there's companies using their green activism as a way to boost their long-term bottom lines? I mean, for instance, to go net zero, it'd take, so we only mine 24 million tons of copper a year. To go net zero, we need 189 years worth of copper mining to go net zero in 20 years. Similar figures for nickel. So I wonder perhaps if Rio Tinto and BHP are looking at this incredibly metals-intensive electrification agenda going,
You beauty.
you beauty. let's go.
Yeah.
And isn't it ironic that we're going to have to rip up more land to get there than with coal, which is in compact coal seams, unlike copper and nickel, which is spread out geologically. It's
yeah.
What do you think? Or am I being conspiratorial?
No, I do think there are. I don't think the main motivation is cynical or profit. Well, I think for the companies it is profit. Like it is, they look at the investors and they determine that you have to have these ESG policies. But I think there are a lot of companies that, you know, are taking advantage of this. If it looks like it's going to be good for business, you know, why not jump on board? You know, if it's particularly like the mining, as you said, or, you know, a lot of technology companies as well that are milking this a little bit. And, you know, it's good for business if people have to stay home and watch Netflix and, you know, do things other than go out and eat and drive around and have a car themselves. So there is, I think there is a part of that which is, does have this business aspect of going, oh, well, if we go down this path, then it's good for me because this is the industry I'm in and it helps the industry that I'm in. And then on top of that, there's also these investors that, you know, will give you money if you follow this path. So yeah. I think there is definitely part of it, which is it's actually, you know, business going, oh, this could be good for business, so let's go with it. Yeah.
Mm.
If I can ask, you know, we've mentioned before that there's the potential national security risk when it comes to work capitalism. We've seen that with Germany, in that they're now utterly dependent on Russia for their gas, and now Russia potentially shut off the pipes. They may experience food shortages over the coming winter. Do you believe that woke capitalism could be a national security risk here?
It definitely has the potential to be, particularly, I mean, the energy security is a massive issue if we're too dependent on, you know, a country to the north of us, which may or may not rhyme with Biner, for particular manufacturing, heavy manufacturing, because it takes too much energy. I think one of the great ironies of which a story which I keep pointing to is like a story in a very, very small story about a recycling plant that closed down in South Australia because it took too much energy and it was too expensive to recycle things, because obviously in order to recycle something you need to have the energy intensity and the price of energy to be competitive, you know, to be cheap enough such that transforming a used product to something that can be used again is economical. But anyway, so this was just one of these like stories of, oh, okay, so the cost of electricity rises, so this recycling plant has closed down because the cost of electricity made it was not feasible to change, you know, to recycle things. So I think definitely those sorts of things, those sorts of issues that we'll start to see if we outsource too much to, you know, to countries that might not be so friendly with us in the future. I think that's definitely a national security risk. I think there's also like a demoralization aspect to this as well, because a lot of this is like pushing that Australia is so bad. We, you know, particularly the anti-colonialism type narrative is very much, you know, it's kind of that our original sin is that we were settled at one point by the British and these sorts of things. And it really makes us sound like a really abhorrent country that, you know, don't have any value going for us. So there is also this like, more spiritual aspect, or, you know, this aspect of woke capitalism that really grates on the national psyche and produces, you know, a population that thinks that, you know, it's evil and has nothing going for it. Could also have that effect as well. So there's the practical and also the kind of the values aspect of this that is not good for the national character, I would say.
The ramifications of it has all been so profound. I mean, you know, since March 2004, the average price of energy and this is adjusted for inflation, was $35 a megawatt. In June, the average price was $400 a megawatt. Yeah, it's an 890% increase. You know, I mean, you mentioned how becoming dependent upon a country that runs with Dyna is dangerous. Well, they've cut us off since January, all urea imports to Australia. So the cost of fertilizer and urea has gone up by 2, 3, 4 times. You know, so the farmers are struggling. You know, I mean, I guess my question is, will it come to a point whereby, you know, these decisions, or perhaps the people who made these decisions, will be held to account? Because, you know, I think we're going to a pretty tough time in this country, and there's going to be a lot of angry people.
Well, I actually think potentially the word capitalists are maybe more likely to be held to account than politicians in some respect, because they're very noticeable. Alan Joyce is very noticeable. You know Alan Joyce more than you know the energy minister at any given time, because he changes so damn much, or she. In this case, it's a he. But so I actually think that there could be the pitchforks start grating when they see, you know, these very noticeable heads of companies, like, as I said, Alan Joyce, or, you know, these sorts of people, and they might, the head of AGL might have something coming for them as well. So I actually think people might get very, very angry, and particularly if there's, you know, mum and dad shareholders that have shares in these companies, particularly, you know, these companies that you can have a shares in, like AGL. I think they might get very angry as well. So there could be a reckoning, and they could actually be held to account for their actions. They're basically operating as a, you know, companies are very hierarchical. You know exactly who's holding the baton at any given time. We have, you know, titles like director and CEO for a reason. We know who's making the decisions, even if they can't be held personally liable because of, you know, the limited liability nature of companies. We know who's making the decision. So I actually think that it's, at least from a reputational point of view, I think they might actually have something coming. I think it would be quite possible that they get held to account.
Why are the Teal independents, who are representing very affluent electorates that want liberal seats, acting so radical about their most progressive beliefs, while underplaying their economic priorities, which happen to be no different from moderate liberals? Do you think they have the capability of changing Parliament, as the media would like to have you believe?
It's a good question. I think probably. I think much like what we've already discussed is that there is a certain type of person that maybe benefits from this, and maybe, you know, they are in a situation where they would benefit from this economically. I think it remains to be seen whether they actually have any power or have any influence over things. It's a bit too early to tell necessarily what the influences of the Teals might be, aside from maybe the Liberal Party maybe realising that their base is no longer in these suburbs as much as it was, and maybe refocusing more on regional and suburban Australia. So I think it's just as a consequence of this realignment that is happening, where the more affluent people are, the more likely they are to hold these, you know, these woke values, these luxury beliefs, as Rob Henderson calls them, that, you know, are very, you know, beneficial, and you can hold them up as a mantle if you're affluent and you have money to pay for the insane cost of electricity at the moment. But if you don't have those, if you're not in that situation, if you're not an elite, then it has great cost on you. So I think it's just a product of this kind of realignment that we're seeing, and, you know, the Teals are kind of the archetype of holding these kinds of luxury beliefs.
Yeah, it's like Mike Brooks. You know, he lives on the water down in Pittwater, and Christina Keneally on Scotland Island. I'm sure she's concerned about climate change. You got Kevin Rudd up in Noosa, living on the water. He's concerned about Obama and Martha's Vineyard. You know, he's living on the water. He must be concerned about climate change. It's the hypocrisy. It's profound.
Yeah, you would think if you're really concerned about climate change, living near close to sea level would be not your priority. But you know, what am I to know? What am I to judge?
Although sometimes it's not merely living close to sea level. Sometimes they've bought this recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you really consider this to be, the greatest, the greatest crisis of our time, and not say, the rise of China or their pact, the security agreement with Russia. Surely you would not live near the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, a similar argument could be made against, the people that are against nuclear energy, for instance. Oh, we must stop climate change. Everything to stop climate change. What about nuclear energy? No, we can't do that. It's like.
Well, if they get cancer, they shouldn't have. What's it called? What's the cancer thing?
Chemotherapy.
Yeah, chemotherapy.
Yeah, I used to work for a radiology company in their legal team, and because Lucas Heights have a monopoly, basically, you need to have these small scale reactors to get, contrast to CT scans and stuff to regional Australia. So when Lucas Heights went down, we had to bring stuff in from US, and it's pretty crazy. We have this full uranium supply in Australia, but we can't actually use it because we're stupid. Sorry. But yes, it's definitely like it's not even like the uses of these things are not just merely energy. It's also this whole industry that could be created, and the benefits that flow from that with nuclear as well.
I do have a question. Why does woke culture attempt to redefine what a nation is, and what has it done to Australian culture?
That's a good question. I don't know whether it really redefines what a nation is. It just doesn't consider it very important. If anything, it considers it a risk, because if people have national ties, then Nazism apparently happens or something. Nationalism breeds xenophobia. That's a bit of a flippant comment, but you get my point, that it's not necessarily a redefining of the nation state or what national identity is. It's more just thinking it is not important, or even more so, it's a net negative to have these national ties.
Right. Well, if I can bring up, there was an essay that I looked at in my undergrad called "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction." It was a Marxist theorist, Walter Benjamin from the Frankfurt School, and he argued, objects have aura, a presence greater than itself. And if you have a mass-produced good, it doesn't have the aura that are not, for example, the Eiffel Tower has greater aura than a photograph of the Eiffel Tower. And so he argued that if you flood society with mass-produced goods, the society loses its aura. The society loses its belief in itself. It's no longer immersed in the creation of its own identity, and then it's open to revolution. Would you argue that this is in a sense the successor of no longer creating your own nation, and that now that you don't create your own nation, now you signal that you think the right thing about your nation?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I can definitely, it has rings of, how we don't have culture necessarily anymore. We don't produce movies in Australia so much unless they're produced by the ABC. And everything we consume on Netflix and these global platforms that don't signal our relationship with Australia in particular, but a kind of global Anglosphere woke culture, particularly if it's Netflix. So we kind of imbibe these general concepts that are apparently applicable in all time and place. It was interesting when you look at the BLM riots in Australia, or BLM riots in US, and how they trickled down to Australia and took exactly the same slogans, exactly the same sort of way of organizing, and applied it to a group which has nothing to do with the original cause. The issues facing Indigenous Australians are completely different. For one thing, they're not an urbanized culture. they're regionalized, and a lot of the problems that they face are to do with the fact that they live in incredibly remote communities. So, the idea that these two things would be analogous is completely preposterous if you look at it on the face. But because of this totalizing kind of ideology, everything is systemic racism, and therefore, BLM in the US is exactly the same phenomenon that you can see in Australia, and likewise in Britain. And it's, across the board, this kind of totalizing ideology.
Well, we've now run out of time. So Dara MacDonald, founder of All Minus One, thank you so much for joining us on Sunday Sessions.
Yeah, it was great to be here. It was good conversation. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. This has been a Macquarie University Liberal Club production. My name is Andrew Kremen. I've been joined by Will Jeffries. We will see you again next week. Farewell.
Thank you.